There we go, there we go, there we go. My name is Michael McFall. I'm the director of the Freeman Spogli Institute. Welcome. I apologize for those that are standing, and I want you to be aggressive about finding open seats now, because everybody who said and had a reserved seat should be here by now. So please, I see one up here. Is that taken, Mike? So.
Mike Thomas is really
Oh. What's that?
I said Mike Thomas is a nice guy. People should.
Oh, I think they were saving it for Professor Sagan, actually, yes. I apologize for that. No, Scott, we actually want you to speak. So we have a hidden agenda by putting you up here, just so you know. Like I'm sure everybody in this room and those watching live and upstairs, live streaming, and in the other rooms that people had to go to. So you're the lucky ones that you got to see. We've all been watching the news. We've all been pretty concerned. I've been watching and reading television and Twitter and newspapers. And at one point I said, there's some interesting commentary here, but there's a lot of shallow commentary. And I thought, man, we have a lot of expertise right here at Stanford. Why don't I just have lunch with these four people and find out what's really going on? And then I thought, I'll bet you there'll be some other people that would be interested in coming to that lunch. So we don't have any lunch, but we do have four fantastic speakers today. We are going to keep this very informal. We deliberately handed out bios to you all just so you know who our speakers are so that we don't go deep into that. But we have really broad expertise on a lot of different dimensions of this crisis. And so let's get into it now. We're going to start. Well, let me introduce everybody, and then we'll start with Abbas. Lisa Blades is here with us, professor of political science and a senior fellow here at the Freeman Spogli Institute. Her last book is not about Egypt, by the way. It's actually about Iraq. It's called State of Repression, Iraq and Under Saddam Hussein, out last year. Actually out now 2 years ago, 2018. We also have here Professor Colin Kahl, who is the co-director of the Center on International Security and Arms Control here at FSI. He's also a senior fellow. In addition to many things that he does here, he also worked in the government, first in the first Obama administration at the Pentagon, and in the second term of the Obama administration working for Vice President Biden as his national security advisor. We also have with us Brett McGurk, who is our Payne Distinguished Lecturer here at FSI this year and next, and who knows when it'll end, but we're grateful that you're here now, Brett. Before coming to Stanford, Brett served as the Special Presidential Envoy for the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS at the U.S. State Department, and he has served both Republican and Democratic administrations. And then last in our list, but first to speak, Professor Abbas Milani, who's also Director of Iranian Studies here at Stanford, an affiliated senior fellow here at FSI, my co-author from time to time, including a piece we just did earlier this week. So we're going to try to triangulate, go deep, go granular, but we're going to start with everybody just giving us their kind of 5 to 8 minute first takes, hot takes as we call them. And Abbas, you're up first.
Well, to tell you the 5 minute is not too short, let me begin by telling you a story about Dostoevsky. They came and told him that he is about to be executed in 5 minutes. He said, I decided to plan all my life. I did everything I planned. I still had 2 minutes left. So I might say everything I need to say and still have 2 minutes left. I'm going to begin about 3 months ago. The Iranian regime was facing what I think was its most serious economic, political, and regional challenges. It was the most serious economically because when they increased the price of gasoline, gasoline is heavily subsidized. When they increased it, and they increased it in the middle of the night, within hours they had demonstrations in over 100 cities. And it became the most substantial challenge to this regime in 40 years. And as a response, they went at these demonstrations with a brutality that is unmatched even in Iran. They killed upward of 1,000 people. There are at least 7,000 to 10,000 people in prison still. People began to question directly Khamenei himself, not just saying death to dictator. Some of the conservatives wrote open letters saying, how can you do this to your own people? All of that changed once the hit on Soleimani happened. The reason the Soleimani hit was important isn't just that he was the head of the Quds Brigade, which operates outside Iran and has been the main orchestrator of proxies. The reason I think it was important is he has a very unusual place in the minds of many Iranians. He has an absolute unique relationship with Khamenei. I don't think in the 40 years I have watched Khamenei, I have ever seen him respond to anyone, have physical contacts with anyone, trust anyone as much as he trusted Soleimani. He was clearly being created by the regime. There was a propaganda, very calculated propaganda campaign to make of him a rather unique character. They talked about him as a Napoleon, they talked about him as a poet, they talked about him as a mystic, they talked about him as the son of the leader. So they had created from him a kind of a iconic figure. And while the IRGC is despised in the minds of the majority of Iranians for being the tools of suppression, most of what Soleimani had been doing had been outside Iran fighting ISIS, had been outside Iran fighting Saddam Hussein in 1980 to 88. So he had a different cachet in terms of the Iranian position and the Iranian psyche. When the hit came, the Iranian regime went into full 24-hour campaign to make this into a major event. The country was shut down for 3 days. Iranian television and radio was constantly talking about him, showing films that appealed to emotion. They talked about him not simply for the few days as a pious soldier, they talked about him as a national hero. They played for the first time in maybe 15 years an iconic song that is a secular, the virtual secular song of Iran. It's to most Iranians the equivalent of a Marseillaise. They had played it in the first day of the revolution. They had played it when Iraq attacked Iran, and then they banned it. They began to play it again. And they went full force. And because they went full force, and because he had a very unusual place, they got hundreds of thousands, some would say several millions. It became the most important demonstration of popular support for anyone since the death of Khomeini. The regime, if it had the slightest prudence, I think could have used this as a moment to say, we are in a crisis, let's organize, let's have a national reconciliation. As soon as the last memorial was finished, sites close to Khamenei, sites close to IRGC began to attack anyone who had ever criticized Khamenei, the IRGC. So they, instead of trying to create out of this a moment of national reconciliation, are trying to use it as a moment of consolidating the most conservative elements of the regime. The problems of the regime are not going to go away. The problems of this regime are fundamentally economic. Every indication is that the economic challenges are going to increase, and once this euphoria has ended, you will see, I think, I would be very surprised if we don't see more demonstrations. So in my view, US policy has to be calibrated in terms of the domestic affairs of Iran, not just what the United States decides to do, and not just whether he was a terrorist and thus it was a good idea to take him out.
Great, Abbas. Let's turn now to Iraq and the broader region. Lisa.
So I'm going to focus my comments on the implications of the recent events for both Iraq and the states of the Arab Gulf. Am I on?
We just need to turn our microphone on. Just give us a sec.
It was Iran, they would say, it was a British conspiracy. They don't want us to have this discussion.
Well, maybe I'll try to project and you guys will,
no.
oh, okay, perfect, thank you.
Back up. Thank you. Emily.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna focus my comments. Can you guys hear me?
Now they can.
Okay.
There you go.
I'm going to focus my comments on the case of Iraq, the implications of recent events for Iraq, and the states of the Arab Gulf. So I think it's important to talk about the situation in Iraq beginning in the summer of 2018. So what was happening then? This was the summer when Iraq had some record-breaking temperatures, 120 degrees plus. People were talking about birds falling out of the sky due to heat, scalding tap water coming out of the taps. And people were having all over Iraq only 2 to 4 hours of electricity a day. They couldn't use their refrigerators. They couldn't run their air conditioners. And this is when people started to get really angry about the state of Iraqi infrastructure. They started to believe that the billions and billions of dollars that had been spent out of Iraqi oil revenue were not going to good causes, but instead they were being wasted on corruption. So if you look at data from polls that were taken in Iraq in the last year, people will by far say their biggest concern is about corruption. They believe that their political regime is corrupt, their political leaders are not representing their interests. And the second thing they'll say is they're very concerned about the state of the economy. So fast forward now to October 2019, we see the protest movement starts to take on a new urgency. Political activists are beginning to, again, draw attention to the crisis of the waste of the revenue that's coming in from oil, the failure of the government to really represent the interests of the people. And what does that mean for the future of Iraq? Of course, people in Iraq, like people around the world, want to have stable, sovereign institutions. They want to have human rights respected. They want to have a government that operates relatively free of corruption. And these were major issues that were leading people into the streets. So what happens when you start to observe something like this domestic popular movement that's critical of Iraq's Shia-dominated leadership? And we see an event like the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. Well, of course, all of those popular social movements now have to take a backseat. So in other words, what we're seeing is the movement was toward this political momentum against the status quo. And as a result of the US intervention, we now start to see the status quo becoming reinforced in some ways that would not have been the case should these domestic political movements have been allowed to proceed as they had been moving forward. So the narrative is completely shifted. And of course, Iraqi politicians are emphasizing the need for security, stability, national sovereignty. These are things all politicians will draw attention to. And this really works against, the US attack really works against the kind of major interests that Iraqi political leaders have at a time when the country is still very fragile. So where are things going in the future? Large numbers of Iraqis are unhappy about the nature of Iranian intervention in their country. They're also very unhappy about the nature of US intervention in Iraq. So when this national poll was conducted in Iraq last year, most Iraqis said they actually wanted to open up their country more to the international economy. But guess what country they are actually having interested in intervening to a greater extent? It's not Iran, it's not the United States. They want China. So more than 50% of Iraqis say that they're interested in having China become more important in their country. Second was Turkey. So why would Iraqis be interested in having China become more invested in the economy of their country? Well, China is promoting a major initiative around the world right now called the Belt and Road Initiative, which seeks to build basic infrastructure connecting Western Asia to Eastern Asia. There is no country in the world that can build infrastructure as cheaply and as quickly as China. So it should not come as a surprise that Iraqis are very tired of both having Iranian and US intervention in their country with their basic problems related to infrastructure, corruption, and the economy. They're seeking other alternatives that are actually quite distant alternatives. So we can turn now to the Arab Gulf states, and here we can think about the fundamental problem of countries like the UAE, Kuwait, or Qatar. What is their fundamental problem? Well, they have a very large influence in the world in terms of security and economy, but we have to think about that balanced against their very small size. So this fundamental disconnect between their size and their strategic and economic importance is what makes them almost uniquely vulnerable in the world from a security perspective. So the Saudis and Emiratis have been pushing back against Iranian influence for some time. But some of the other countries in the region, like Oman, Kuwait, and Qatar, have actually been trying to maintain some forms of diplomatic and political relations with Iran in a way that may actually be very important moving forward. So there have been a lot of tensions within the GCC in recent years. This crisis may actually help to bring some of these GCC tensions, maybe not to a close, but to reduce some of these, because all of the GCC countries are very invested in bringing an end to the current crisis. Instability in the Gulf threatens very hard-won advances for these countries in terms of economic influence and international prestige. So all of these countries have really sought to increase their international profile over the last couple of decades. Now, one of the Iranian threats that was made was against the city of Dubai. I don't know if any of you saw that news. Dubai, of course, is home to millions of people. It's a major transportation and economic hub for Western Asia. Hitting Dubai makes absolutely no sense at all. Not only does Dubai have no strategic military value, it also is home to 500,000 Iranians, many of whom help to provide a kind of economic safety valve for the Iranian regime because they're able to engage in economic activities in the UAE. So that really was just something that really kind of was a threat to the basic security and stability that these countries have been working so hard to achieve over the last few decades. As you probably know, Qatar is slated to host the 2022 World Cup. Now, if you're in a position to host the first World Cup in the Arab world, the last thing you want to have is a crisis in the Gulf when you're seeking to attract literally hundreds of thousands of international visitors from around the world. Qatar has invested billions in infrastructure, stadiums. They just opened a new metro system. This is an absolute nightmare to have this type of instability. So the last thing I'm going to say is about Saudi. I don't know if any of you have seen in the newspaper or online, the Saudis are now trying to attract tourism, right? So all of this instability is not only devastating from the perspective of their economic interests as they pursue their varied national plans over the next decade, but it's also bad for business, it's bad for tourism, it's bad for all of the things that they're trying to achieve. And so my expectation is that they'll work as quickly as they can to diffuse some of this tension and maybe even bring together some of the Gulf interests, which fundamentally are very closely tied to each other.
Great, fantastic.
Colin. Hi, how are you? Can you hear my? Good. Thanks, Mike. I think as you heard from both Abbas and Lisa, there is a broader context in which the strike against Soleimani happened, and that's true with regards to what Mike asked me to start off talking about too, which is what we can expect in terms of the Iranian reaction moving forward. We've obviously already seen some reaction. I'm going to talk about that, but what can we expect in the days and weeks ahead? And there, I'd like to start by saying that what we've seen in just the past 2 weeks didn't occur in a vacuum. It's actually just the latest in a tit-for-tat cycle of pressure and provocation between the United States and Iran that has really unfolded and escalated over the last 18 months. So I'm going to say a little bit about that to make sure we kind of level set the context in which current events are happening. This all really began in May of 2018 when Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, better known as the Iran nuclear deal, and reimposed crippling secondary sanctions against Iran's banking and energy sectors. After about a year of restraint, the Iranians in 2019, facing a precipitous fall in oil exports, they had, prior to the sanctions, been exporting about 2.5 million barrels of oil a day. They are now down to just a handful of a few hundred thousand barrels a day. And this is really the lifeblood of the Iranian economy and the revenue for the regime. And so Iran started to apply its own counter pressure. If the United States was applying pressure on Iran through sanctions, Iran was going to create pressure by creating a sense of crisis in the Gulf that would threaten the global economy and many of the interests that Lisa alluded to. And so what have we seen? We saw the shooting down of a U.S. Surveillance drone over the Gulf. We saw the sabotaging of oil tankers off the coast of the UAE and through the Strait of Hormuz. We saw a number of attacks, first by the Houthis and then probably by the Iranians themselves, against critical energy infrastructure inside of Saudi Arabia, kind of pointing a dagger at the heart of global oil supplies. And over the past few months, we've seen a significant uptick in rocket attacks against U.S. forces present in Iraq on Iraqi bases. And it was in that context that you saw an attack on December 27th by an Iranian proxy group known as Kateb Hezbollah, an Iraqi Shia group with very close ties to the IRGC, launched 31 rockets against a joint Iraqi-U.S. base near Kirkuk in northern Iraq. That, unlike previous rocket attacks, actually hurt some people, to include killing an American contractor and wounding a number of American and Iraqi service members. On December 29th, Trump authorized a retaliatory strike against Kateb Hezbollah targets in both Iraq and Syria, hitting 5 bases on both sides of the border, killing more than 24 Kateb Hezbollah fighters and wounding dozens of others. According to reporting, and none of us were in the room obviously, but I think there's a lot of corroborated reporting at this point, that during the deliberations that Trump had for whether he should strike back at Kateb Hezbollah, he was presented a series of escalatory options to go back at Iran and its proxies, and one of those options was to take out Qasem Soleimani and perhaps other IRGC leadership. I say perhaps other leadership because we're seeing reporting as of today, for example, that there was a simultaneous strike or raid taken against an IRGC official in Yemen that wasn't successful around the same time. So Trump was essentially presented with a series of options. Now, I worked at the Pentagon, and a lot of times they take what could be called a Goldilocks approach, right? They'll present the president with 3 options: total war, capitulation to the enemy, or the option we want. And my sense is that they probably put 5 or 6 options in front of Trump, and according to the reporting, the Soleimani option was on the far extreme thing, anticipating the president would not want to do that because of how provocative it was, but in fact would tack back toward the center. But again, according to the reporting, Trump was like, oh, let's do that. He initially decided not to take out Soleimani and instead do the Kateb Hezbollah attacks. But on December 29th, when Kateb Hezbollah and other Shia militia in Iraq organized a siege of the U.S. embassy, which I think was a miscalculation on their behalf, it presented Trump with a kind of Benghazi-like scenario, or a kind of Carter-Iran hostage crisis type of scenario. And on the surface, the administration was trying to de-escalate things, trying to work with the Iraqi security forces to get the demonstrators to leave and to calm things down, make sure our diplomats were safe. But behind the scene, Trump apparently was seething. And it was in this context that he tacked back towards the option to kill Qasem Soleimani. And about 36 hours later, JSOC, our Special Operations Forces inside of Iraq, used a MQ-9 Reaper drone to kill Qasem Soleimani as he arrived at the Baghdad International Airport. He also killed the leader of Kateb Hezbollah and a number of other Iraqi militia officials. And it was in that context, of course, then that the Iranians decided to retaliate by launching an overt attack against U.S. Personnel inside Iraq, launching more than 20 ballistic missiles, short-range and medium-range ballistic missiles against Iraqi bases in western Iraq at al-Assad and northern Iraq in Erbil that house American troops. Now, fortunately for everybody involved, there doesn't appear to have been any deaths or significant casualties either among Americans or Iraqis, and it's fortunate not only because people didn't die, but also because it allowed Trump to have an off-ramp. Had American blood been spilled there, I think you would have seen strikes inside of Iran in retaliation, and then I think we would have been off to the races. Because once we would have struck the Iranian homeland, I think there would have been a massive escalatory dynamic. So I guess the question then is, why did the Iranians respond the way they did? Are things about to settle down? I think you've seen a lot in the news of trying to portray Qasem Soleimani as kind of the equivalent of an Osama bin Laden or a Baghdadi, a kind of terrorist mastermind at the head of a vast network of terrorists and militants. And to some degree, that is an accurate characterization. But it is not the only way in which Qasem Soleimani is viewed. As Abbas alluded, this is perhaps the second most prominent official in the Iranian government, that despite his title, it doesn't really have the equivalent in the United States, but you can kind of think of him as a mashup between the director of the CIA, the Secretary of Defense, and the Shadow Secretary of State, all rolled into one. And you can imagine if an American Secretary of Defense had been killed on foreign soil by another state, how escalatory that would be in our view. And I think for the Iranians, they saw this as a declaration of war. And in that context, their ballistic missile response was actually fairly restrained. And it raises the question of, is it over? And you've heard conflicting remarks coming out of the Iranian regime. On the one hand, the Iranian foreign minister was quick after the ballistic missile strike to suggest that the retaliation had concluded, suggesting that it was over. You've had IRGC officials suggest that they did not intend to kill any Americans, although they're also telling the Iranian people that they killed scores of Americans. So there's a little bit of a contradiction there. But you're also seeing indications in the media from IRGC officials and other regime officials, and Abbas would know more, that actually this was just the first shot. And that a harsher revenge can be expected in the future. And my guess would be that you're not likely to see an overt strike, but rather that the Iranians will take their time and strike covertly or in a deniable fashion by trying to hit American assets in the region. It could be in Iraq, it could be in eastern Syria where they're quite vulnerable, it could be throughout the Gulf. Through the use of proxies, through the use of terrorism, through the use of covert action. And if any one of those strikes draws blood, American blood, then I think we can expect ourselves to be back on the escalatory ladder. That's point one. The second point I would make is that none of the reasons why Iran has become more provocative have gone away. As Abbas noted, just like the pressure on the economy, it will continue to build, and that will have domestic political consequences in Iran. It will also be a factor driving the Iranians to create counter pressure through more provocations in the region. The same thing we've been seeing unfold over the last several months. And last but not least, we've seen the Iranians retaliate against what the United States did by further backing away from their nuclear obligations under the 2015 nuclear deal negotiated by the Obama administration alongside our allies in Europe, Russia, and China with Iran. The announcement that they made the other day was actually it was the fifth step they've taken away. The United States violated the deal first. Iran was restrained for about a year, but Iran over the last several months has taken a number of steps to increase their stockpile of low-enriched uranium beyond the limits set in the deal, to enrich at higher levels, to reactivate research and development into more advanced centrifuges, and to reopen a deeply buried enrichment facility at a place called Fordow. But they took the biggest step after the Soleimani strike, which was to say that now that all the restrictions on uranium enrichment, which was the core of the Iran nuclear deal, no longer hold. Why does that matter? Because even if we avoid an escalatory cycle that is related to Soleimani and the strike per se, Iran is now back on the pathway to shrinking the time it would take for them to generate the explosive fuel for a nuclear weapon. And I will tell you, as the guy who oversaw war planning for Iran at the beginning of the Obama administration, where we thought a war was very likely, either because we would have to take action if Iran got too close to a nuke, or Israel would and drag us in, that I could very easily envision us getting back into a situation like we were in 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, where the region was on a knife's edge of a major war because either the United States or Israel were going to take action against a rapidly growing Iranian nuclear capability. So I think the good news is the crisis has tamped down for now. The bad news is I see possibilities for it ramping back up because of these existing dynamics and because of the nuclear issue coming back into the foreground. Thanks.
Fantastic, Colin.
Brett.
So thanks. Is this working? Yeah. Okay, let me dovetail a little bit off of what Colin said and make a broader strategic point, and then I want to focus on following off of some of what Lisa said about Iraq, but particularly the counter-ISIS campaign and kind of where we are. On a strategic point, I spent a lot of time in the Situation Room over 3 administrations, a lot of time with Colin. I've also spent a lot of time out executing policy, and somewhat like Qasem Soleimani used to do, actually. But the question I always ask in the Situation Room is, what is our objective? What are we trying to achieve? How are we going to do it? And what are our resources? Those 3 basic questions. If you can't define your objective, you're going to get yourself in trouble. If you don't really understand how you're going to do it, and if your resources aren't there, you're going to fail. So you have to align those 3 things, a basic element of strategy and ends, ways, and means. When it comes to the Trump administration, there's been this massive incoherence and gap because the national security strategy, which basically tells the US government, here's where we're going to prioritize. National security strategy came out in December 2017, and then a national defense strategy a month later, and it makes very clear it's a major shift, a paradigm shift. We're actually going to reduce our commitments in the Middle East. We've been too invested in the Middle East. We've been too invested in counterterrorism post 9/11. We've done pretty good at that. We know how to do it. But now we're going to shift to great power competition. And that means we're going to shift our resource focus, our diplomatic focus, our prioritization to Asia and China and Russia. That's the national security strategy. That is like driving the departments and agencies throughout the US government, the national security strategy. At the same time, a few months later, President Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, and announced the new Iran policy, which is an uber maximalist policy. We are going to pull out of the nuclear deal. We're going to do that unilaterally. That means we cut all of our channels of communication with the Iranians. And we are going to basically try to strangle Iran's economy in a bathtub. It's an economic strangulation policy. John Bolton has said it's regime change. That's what he wants. Pompeo, others say something different. But it is a maximalist policy. And there was a debate in the administration about if you go down that road, we are liable to get sucked back into the Middle East in a major way because the Iranians will not just come to the table under pressure, they will actually start to fight back. And then we will be drawn into this potential tit-for-tat escalation. There was another camp that was more optimistic, said no. They will be under such economic pressure, they will have no choice but to come back to the table in a weakened position and we'll get a better deal. And that's a legitimate debate. That's a debate kind of within the 30-yard lines of the football field. Everybody stipulates Iran is a bad actor, we want to contain them. The question is, how do you go about it? So for the first year of the Iran policy, Iran didn't really do that much. And so the more optimistic camp, I think, could say, hey, maybe we had the right argument. But starting in May of last year, the more cautious camp, I think, has been proven right. So Iran started attacks in the Gulf against shipping, which they have not taken credit for, deniable attacks. And our Gulf partners, interestingly, have not accused the Iranians of those, even though we all know it's the Iranians. They shot down the American drone, which almost led to a response. And then this incredible state-on-state attack against the Aramco facility in Saudi Arabia. That had not been happening until May of last year. We, in response, in this action-reaction cycle, the United States sent more and more U.S. military forces into the region. 3,000 here, 2,000 there, an aircraft carrier. It's up now, by my count, approaching 20,000 additional U.S. military personnel since May. So this is an irreconcilable nature of the overall national security strategy and the maximalist Iran policy. And you can't have both. I really don't think you can have both. If you want to pursue this maximalist Iran policy, you need to be prepared for significant contingencies in the Middle East and prioritize the Middle East as your priority theater. Just in December, just a month ago, a few weeks ago, the Secretary of Defense said his priority theater is Asia and China. Acting Secretary of Defense Shanahan said China, China, China. That's not the case if you're pursuing this Iran policy, as I think we're now seeing. So there's an incoherence in the strategy, and we're now where we are. And I very much agree with Colin, this is not over by any stretch. But where are we on things like countering ISIS? So let me just go back to the summer of 2014. ISIS takes over basically territory in Iraq and Syria, 8 million people, acts of genocide, planning and plotting major 9/11 type attacks against the West, a total catastrophe. We negotiated with the Iraqis to return U.S. military forces together with a big coalition. We built a big coalition all around the world. About 20 other countries came into Iraq with us, one by one. Everyone from New Zealand to Finland to France to the UK to Denmark. They're all there with us, NATO, for the objective of countering ISIS. And we did it in a very smart way. We said this is not going to be the Iraq War style, that we're really responsive to the concern of endless wars and overinvestment, overcommitment. We're not going to be fighting. We're going to do this in a limited way, in a careful way. So that started in the summer of 2014. And I don't have to go through the whole campaign. I think overall, and it's not without problems, this is a real war. But overall, I think it was pretty successful. And as President Trump said, we took back the rest of the caliphate. But that campaign was designed to be sustainable and long-term and to allow our forces to remain in place for years. Because we knew, and one lesson we've learned is that you can't just pick up stakes and say that's over. So in Syria, we've basically already given all of that up. This is another incoherence in what we're doing in Iran. I can talk about Syria. But in Iraq, what really concerns me now is that the counter-ISIS campaign has stopped. So all of our forces in Iraq now are focused on protecting themselves. NATO has a very small mission, but NATO has stopped. Everything has stopped. And it wasn't very long ago in Iraq that ISIS had the ability to put about 60 suicide bombers and car bombs into the streets of Baghdad. And one reason we've been able to see this incredibly inspiring youthful protest movement in the streets of Baghdad is because you don't have that risk of 50, 60 car bombs a month in Baghdad. If those networks reconstitute, is going to snuff out that very promising movement. You've also had, from the counter-ISIS campaign, and this is in all the polling data and everything else we've seen, a real kind of nationalist, post-sectarian sentiment, an incredible shift from 4 to 5 years ago. About 30,000 Iraqis were killed fighting ISIS. So by population, about 300,000 Americans or so. It has an incredible psychological change in the country. So the Sunni Shia divisions are much decreased. It is a real nationalist, patriotic trend. And that's something I think we want to try to nurture. But for that to nurture, we need to do a couple things. We need to keep pressure on ISIS because these networks are there. They can reconstitute very easily. And again, we are not taking casualties. We're not spending much money. We have a big coalition. This is very important to maintain this. And right now, the Iraqi government is asking us to leave. And I think we can work through that if we're smart. I was part with Colin and others to do the negotiation for us to return. I know how we did that. We designed it in a way that we can't just be kicked out immediately. It will start a process of discussion. But we have to be patient and cautious and be very careful what we say as a government. And I question the ability of the Trump administration to have that level of discipline, although I know we have a great ambassador out there, they're really trying. But we have to keep pressure on ISIS. And secondly, our presence with all these Western powers in NATO provides a long-term balance to the significant amount of Iranian influence in the country. So if we just leave, we cede the field entirely. And who will enter if we leave? Russia. Russia has wanted to come into, including in the counter-ISIS campaign. The Russians always show up to the Iraqis and say, hey, we can come in and do this even better. And the Iraqis have wanted us. But if we leave, ISIS, you have the ISIS resurgence, you have Iran really having the run of southern Iraq, and Russia will be showing up in the bases that we leave almost immediately, similar to what we've seen in Syria. So it would be an irretrievable strategic setback in my view, and I'm hopeful that there will be no irretrievable decisions made in this moment of heightened passion and intensity. We need to quiet, slow things down, start a process of discussion, and get out of this in a way that allows us to maintain our presence. One final point. The president, when he spoke the other day, said there should be a NATO mission to come to the Middle East and kind of take, this is no understanding of how NATO works. So you spend a lot, NATO can't make a decision without unanimity, all 29 allies now. So that means all 29 capitals would have to agree to come into the Middle East to do what? It's still unclear. That is just not going to happen. I would love for that to happen. It's not going to happen. So we need to be realistic. We have pursued this Iran policy unilaterally. We don't have many allies with us. Even our Gulf colleagues now, partners, are very nervous. And we need to really make a decision, I think, in Washington. Is this our priority? Or are we still with where we are on the national security strategy? Because right now, you can't have everything. And the risks are continuing to increase. And saving our position in Iraq is quite fundamental to all of our objectives.
Well, first of all, thank you all for those initial remarks. Yeah. I think I wrote down 23 questions that I want to ask. But you know what? I think I'm just going to ask one historic question and one specific question about Iraq and Iran, and then get to our audience. We have a giant audience here, and we have lots of expertise in this audience too. So let's do that. And I want to first focus building on both what Colin and Brett said about helping us understand strategy and the relationship between strategy and the goals and objectives that we're seeking to achieve. And then I want to ask, and everybody should comment, but I also want to ask concrete questions about the governments in Iraq and Iran. So, if I think about it abstractly, I think there's a lot of consensus about basic things we want with respect to our policy towards Iran. We don't want them to have a nuclear weapon. We want to reduce their influence in the region. And let me put this in parentheses, but some people think that we should be promoting democracy and human rights inside Iran, right? So come back to that parentheses one as you like. The Obama administration, of which I was a part of for a while, 5 years, it was a long while, and Iran, by the way, was a central part of what we were doing in the early years, including with Russia. We prioritized denying them a nuclear weapon. I think that's fair, Colin, right? And critics of that strategy said, well, you ignored Iranian influence and you ignored the people in Iran. So I'm interested in, and now we have a new strategy, maximum pressure, I think you called it, Brett. And just can I just say parenthetically that this hyper black and white, you're either engaging or you're confronting, just back to your choices at the Pentagon. My own experience in the government is that effective strategies have a mix of those things. The idea that the Obama administration was just engaging the terrorists, and then the word appeasement usually shows up, forgets about a lot of pressure that we put on them with respect to sanctions before, and forgets about some cyber stuff that I don't think I'm allowed to even talk about. But it's just I want us to free ourselves of the idea that you either have to go to war or you have to appease people, right? But they have a strategy. They laid it out, as you said. How do you then assess on those three big goals how this new strategy has it gotten us any closer to it? The president declared pretty emphatically yesterday that it has. And he declared pretty emphatically that the previous strategy was not working. So back to your point about ends and ways, old strategy, how well was it doing with those three objectives? And now how is the new strategy? And then the other question on Iran and Iraq. Everybody can answer whatever they want. But Abbas, especially for you, I'm curious now how the reaction inside the country will to the tragic shoot down of this Ukrainian Airlines plane. And by the way, the tragic loss of 50 lives, maybe more, in the funerals for Mr. Soleimani. How is that impacting the internal debate about their attitudes towards the regime? And for Lisa and for everybody else, I'm also interested in, I just read today that the State Department declared we're staying in Iraq. Maybe that's the way it works in the Middle East. I don't know.
After a phone call where the Prime Minister asked us to leave.
Yeah, well,
Literally.
so all of you, I wanted to jump in terms of the bilateral part, but I'm also curious, how does that play inside Iraq? You have a caretaker government. How is that going to play in terms of the internal domestic politics within Iraq, especially given the very intriguing thing you said about what they really want is China, not Iran or the United States. So anybody want to jump in on any of those?
Well, I want to piggyback on the kind of mismatch between our objectives and the resources and how that fits with strategy. And very briefly, and I could talk about this for hours, but the three administrations we've had since 9/11 have pursued very different strategies towards the Middle East. To be grossly simplistic, the Bush administration, especially the first George W. Bush administration, pursued maximalist objectives in the sense of transforming the region into a more democratic place through a policy of regime change that was meant to start in Iraq but not end in Iraq. It was meant to set across a kind of a series of dominoes that would transform the region and address the core roots of the challenges that they saw emerging from extremism and weapons of mass destruction after 9/11. And they were willing to commit enormous amounts of resources toward that endeavor. 250,000 troops on any given day between Iraq and Afghanistan, trillions of dollars. The surge, the last time we beat al-Qaeda in Iraq, we beat ISIS, the offshoot of al-Qaeda in Iraq. Lately, the surge, just those 2 years of the surge, cost $275 billion. 2 years. And 1,000 U.S. deaths in that period and thousands more wounded. So it was what I would argue, it was a policy essentially of onshore hegemony. We were going to prioritize the Middle East. It was the center of gravity for our national security strategy, and we were going to devote enormous amounts of blood and treasure toward that objective. And to say the least, I think the strategy failed. Its ambitions were too big, and our success was too small. The Obama administration wanted to reprioritize other parts of the globe, especially the Asia Pacific, with the pivot or the rebalance, whatever you call it. I think it shrunk our objectives in the Middle East to non-transformative objectives, largely dealing with the nuclear threat that Iran posed through diplomacy and through targeted counterterrorism operations to keep the homeland threat in the region at bay, but otherwise to seek, in kind of Obama's controversial language, a degree of equilibrium in the region, where both our traditional partners, like those in the Gulf and Israel, and Iran would have to figure out how to live and let live in the region, and that would facilitate us reducing our presence and the amount of attention that we had to spend on the Middle East so we could redevote it towards the Asia Pacific and also towards Europe after the Russian intervention in Ukraine. Again, I think there were mixed results of that, but you can kind of describe that approach as an offshore balancing approach. Trump, I think, has basically combined the worst elements of both. He's combined a degree, or at least his advisors have, a degree of Bush's maximalism about how much we want to impose our will on the region, but is not willing to put very much skin in the game. right? And so as a consequence, we have these grandiose plans to, I mean, whatever, Trump says his goal is not regime change in the region. It is the goal of most of his advisors, and the maximalist objectives set for diplomacy with Iran are the equivalent of regime change, even if you don't call it that. And we've gone all in with our allies across the region, and we are trying to impose our will at the region, but to do it with very little skin in the game. And that isn't working, because the other side, the enemy, gets a vote. And the Iranians are escalating, and that's drawing the Americans back in. So they're not able to achieve Trump's objectives of imposing our will while pulling out of the Middle East, because there's a mixed match between the two. So I would call Trump's approach offshore hegemony, not working either. The last point I will make on this is the Trump administration's own stated objectives for pulling out of the Iran deal is we'll get a better Iran deal. We haven't. The Iranians have restarted their program. We're closer to an Iranian nuclear weapon than we've been in years because of Trump's policies. Second, that we were supposed to roll back Iranian provocations and aggression in the region. The Iranians have been more provocative, more assertive, and we are closer to war as a consequence, and the Soleimani strike is in that context. And the third is that we are going to turn Iran into a normal country, which is another way of talking about regime change. And as Abbas said, I think we could have debated 3 or 4 weeks ago where we were on that as a consequence of the public reaction on the street. But I will say there's not a lot of historical predicate for imposing regime change through economic sanctions overseas, and the Soleimani strike has at least provided an opportunity for the regime in the near term to kind of circle the wagons, rally the flag, depending on your metaphor. So I don't think they're achieving that objective either. But other than that, everything's great.
In terms of the strategic vision that you said the Trump administration adheres to, that the coming crisis or the coming challenge is China and Russia. That there is a Cold War on the horizon, and it's going to be between the United States, the West, and these two countries. If that is actually the game, I can tell you with absolute certainty, China and Russia have never been as strong in the Persian Gulf as they are today. Never. In 200 years, Russia has never had a naval base in the Persian Gulf. They're about to get one. Never in history has China, Russia, and Iran had joint naval operations in the Persian Gulf. They just had one about 3 weeks ago. The degree of influence that China and Russia have in Iran and have in the Persian Gulf, have in countries like Saudi Arabia, where they're trying to invest money, in Iraq, as you indicated, has never been as great as it is today. So if the vision of the strategic vision is to curtail and control China and Russia's influence in that region, it's certainly failing. In terms of the domestic response to all of this, I think what has to be remembered is the seriousness of the crisis that the regime has faced. And the kind of binary, did the old strategy work or is this one working, fails to take one aspect in consideration. What if we had something between these two? What if we had a strategy that was based actually on the realities in Iran? The reality in Iran is that this is a regime that has lost its legitimacy politically. It has not proven capable of solving the fundamental economic problems of Iranian society. Iran is, I think, the only country in the world. One economist mentioned this, Larry Diamond, and I translated his work, part of his work, and put it in a book edited. He says there's no country in the world that has had double-digit inflation, double-digit unemployment for 40 years in a row. That's the reality of the Iranian economy. This regime is plundering Iran. The privatization that this regime has gone through is as bad as what they did in Russia. And people in Iran are finding this out. That, to me, was the context for developing the U.S. strategy. Contain them where they become aggressive regionally, but you need to work with the reality in Iran. And you need to understand that the United States cannot, should not try to determine what the next regime in Iran is. You cannot have Mr. Bolton determining who the next successor regime in Iran is. The Iranian people are the only people who can and should determine their future. The good news is they want to change. The bad news is for the United States, they don't want the United States to change it. For the first time, 2 days ago, Pompeo ordered U.S. Embassies not to contact some of the groups that they have been contacting. But you have Bolton, you have the president's private attorney going to meetings, determining who the successor to this Iranian regime is
That's
going to be.
Mr. Giuliani, just to make everything clear. Yeah,
Yes.
he's being a little polite there, yes.
No, because he's disappeared from television. I decided not to mention his name. Maybe he's become a persona non grata around the world. So to me, unless the United States goes on the path of de-escalation, Iran's problem does not have a military solution. This is not a regime, folks, that is going to walk away from power. This is a regime that turned Syria into what Syria is today in order to keep Assad in power. And they literally told the Iranian people, literally, that see what we did in Syria? We'll do more in Iran if you challenge us. So the solution to Iran is a democratic Iran. The solution to Iran has to come from within Iran. Some of the steps that have been taken in the last few weeks and few months, in my view, accept the economic pressure that has brought the regime to its knees. Right? That economic pressure has worked, and it has worked again because this regime is corrupt, it is incompetent, its management style is absolutely devoid of any kind of serious attention to what it needs to do. Strategy has to work on that basis. If U.S. strategy in '86 in Soviet Union completely overlooked the reality of the Soviet Union, you wouldn't have had the end of the Cold War. Iranian strategy is no less. Iran is as fraught a society, as corrupt and as incompetent and as bereft of legitimacy as Soviet Union was in '87. That to me is the beginning of any cogent strategy.
Lisa.
So Mike asked about what do Iraqis think? What do Iraqis want? Imagine you're an Iraqi born in 1970. You're being raised in a middle-income country that has infrastructure, you're getting the benefits of higher oil prices, growth of universities, education systems, hospitals, everything is improving in your country. 1980, you begin an 8-year conventional war against your next door neighbor that's 3 times as large as you are. And you're absolutely bleeding money, you're bleeding men in a desperate attempt to try to put the army back to work and to get some cash. You invade your neighbor, Kuwait. You now enter 13 years of crippling economic sanctions. Okay, so not only have these people now started from a place of prosperity, of economic development, you've gone through war, you've gone through sanctions, and now you enter civil war. Okay, so now you see the 2000s, the country is absolutely torn against itself. You enter the 2010s, and what do you have? You have the rise of ISIS. Now, it is unrealistic to think that Iraq is not going to have influence from Iran. Iran is its neighbor. Iran has a lot of influence in the country right now. It's better to have a collaborative relationship with Iran than to be at war with Iran. We saw what the cost of that was for the Iraqi people. It's also unrealistic at this point to imagine that the US is not going to have a major role or influence to play in Iraq to one degree or another. But I think Iraqis are really looking to try to shed a lot of this baggage and to try to pursue a national agenda of their own that reflects the interests of the Iraqi people. And I think that's what the social protest movement really represents. Now, whether it will be allowed to flourish or whether it will be nipped in the bud, for example, by Iranian snipers who are sitting on the roofs of buildings to try to take out protesters, we don't know. But there really isn't even a kind of memory of many young Iraqis of a life that was not one of complete crisis and war and devastation. So it's really been a very, very tough history, and people just want a chance to kind of live their lives, pursue their economic interests, have their political representatives provide them with basic things like electricity and clean water, but up until now, it's just been rolling from one crisis to another for the country.
Brett, last word?
I think, Mike,
before
you
we turn
asked
to the
about
audience?
the Iraqi request for us to leave and what we should say. Here's what is kind of going on in Iraq. Some of these proxy groups, such as Kataib Hezbollah, they're still there. They still have capabilities. I've been involved in the dark arts of making sure they never attack us. And so from 2011 until just a couple months ago, they weren't attacking us. And that included some very direct messages to the Iranians. It included some things we did for deterrence. But for whatever reason, I think because of the tit-for-tat escalation that began in May, they apparently began launching rockets at us again in October of last year. The Prime Minister of Iraq is trying to make sure that they don't launch any rockets at our facilities, because we're in a situation where if some rockets are launched at our facilities, and if there's a casualty, we're right back to where we were. But a lot of these groups are probably itching to do something. So the Iraqis are in a very difficult position trying to deter that, and I think we have to allow them to work to try to deter that. One way he's trying to deter it is saying, I'm beginning a process with the Americans to discuss their future withdrawal. But he's saying it very carefully, I think, as I read his statements. And of course, that parliament vote was only a sliver of the parliament. It wasn't even all the Shia parties. The Kurds weren't there, the Sunnis weren't there. So I think we have an opportunity to kind of to slow this down. And to do that, though, we have to be very smart in how we respond. We are fully supportive of, we want to see a sovereign Iraq. We're willing to enter into discussions with the Iraqis about the future relationship. To get into a situation in which whatever you say we're staying, I think could actually make the situation worse and make it more liable that we're likely to leave, which would be a disaster. One thing Iraq really needs, and this is how we can be on the side of these protesters in the street and on the side of what is really, I think, a critical mass of opinion in the post-ISIS phase of Iraq. There was an election in 2018 in which the turnout was so low that the results did not reflect at all this mood and this pulse in the country, which Lisa has identified. The turnout was so low that the winner of the election was the ultra-nationalist, very anti-American cleric, Muqtada al-Sadr, who we used to be in a state of combat with. The number two party that won was a heavily Iranian-backed party, and then the kind of more moderate actors came in a distant third, fourth, fifth. That election did not represent the mood of the Iraqi population. There's now a trend towards having a new election. I think we should get behind that, have a new election, a new UN-backed election with a broader turnout. It would really, I think, reset the dynamic. And out of that, you could then make decisions for the future. I think that would be a very important thing. It would be a huge mistake if President Trump does what he did in Syria, where if we have a couple bad days or something happens and he says, well, we're just going to leave Iraq or something, that would be really catastrophic. And so I know there are a lot of voices working this policy who I used to work with who are really trying to get to calm this thing down, buy time, and that really is the right approach. And the Iraqis are trying to work through this as best they can. I think the Prime Minister will be in Kurdistan tomorrow. They're all trying to figure out how to deal with this in a way that they don't make irretrievable decisions when passions are at their height.
Great, so we have some time for questions from the audience. I think we have microphones. If you could just get my attention and then introduce yourselves and then ask your question, or and Q&A, please ask those in the overflow spaces to come to the BCC if they have questions. So we have some more seats. First up, Professor Sagan. Okay.
Yes, I'm Scott Sagan from the Center for International Security, the Freeman Spogli Institute, and the Department of Political Science. I have an observation about ethics, law, and revenge. And then that's from the U.S. perspective, and I want to hear Abbas's views about the Iranian perspective. The observation is that the attack on Soleimani is a very complicated legal question, whether it was legal or not, because of the declaration of the IRGC being a terrorist group, because of claims without evidence that it was a preemptive attack because of planning attacks against us. What was clearly not a legal threat was President Trump's statement that if there's an attack against us, we will attack 52 sites to symbolize the taking of 52 American hostages, and we will attack cultural sites. So the question is, and I was glad that the Defense Department pushed back and said, no, we're not going to do that, Mr. President. My question is, how does it play in Iran? A, to what degree was that threat of attacking cultural sites reported, and how did people take it? B, do they believe the claims? Does the public believe the claims of the regime that they killed already scores of American soldiers in Iraq and that the U.S. is lying about it? And C, is there in Farsi a phrase like the Sicilian phrase, revenge is a dish best tasted cold?
There is always a Persian expression. Don't ever think there is a expression, there is a reality for which there isn't. First of all, I think one of the most egregious things that the president did was make that threat. It is absolutely against international law, and it absolutely was used by the Iranian regime to full benefit, saying this is the kind of a person that we are fighting. Iranians are rightly, I think, very proud of their culture. Some of the world's greatest buildings, some of the UNESCO's greatest monuments are in Iran. And people began to put pictures of these monuments on the website, the social media, Twitter, all of these things became very, very active. So I think that was a very wrong. And in terms of views on revenge, we don't have one Iran. We have at least two Irans. We have the Iran of the regime, whose rhetoric is based on Shiite ideology of an eye for an eye, whose action is much more pragmatic. I mean, if they wanted to take this to an eye for an eye, they could have done it. They didn't need to hit the more or less empty base with advance warning. They could have hit the US bases, for example, in Bahrain. It is as close. They have even more sophisticated missiles that they could have used. They needed to show revenge for their base, but at the same time, they didn't want to go to a full war. That's why they kept lying about it. That's why they said we have killed 80. Fortunately, the regime is so full of lies historically that except a very small minority, no one believes them. And we now have a fairly reliable poll inside Iran, divulged by a reformist paper, that says less than 10% of Iranians, before all of this happened, were happy with the status quo. Less than 10%. And I think if you ask, they asked people at the university, that was several months ago, what percent of you, who would you believe in this world? 8% said they believed the clergy. The spiritual guides of the country have now become so bereft of authority that whatever they say is not very seriously believed. Khamenei, and as several comments were made, Khamenei and commanders of the IRGC keep repeating that this isn't our revenge. Khamenei literally said, no, this wasn't a revenge, this was a slap in the face. The real revenge is coming. IRGC commanders keep repeating the same nonsense. So it's not just Donald Trump that occasionally says things that helps keep this tension alive. Some of these people, and the reason they say it is because if we are right that the regime is facing economic crisis, there are going to be demonstrations. They need the IRGC, they need the militia to suppress this movement. And it is them who are clamoring for revenge, whether served cold or the Persian style.
But Boss, just to follow up on that just for a second, do they not have a problem with their conservative base? I mean, you know, people can read and know that they didn't do anything. Is that not a problem for the regime to look so weak and timid, or they can just get away with that? I mean, I'm just thinking of other countries, including our own. That would not be sufficient for the Trump base if something like this happened to somebody in the Trump administration. Why is it so easy for them just to say, well, we've exacted revenge, or is it a problem and they have to worry about their conservative base?
Well, I think they had to worry about their conservative base, as I said, when they went after people and killed with absolute brutality. Some within the conservative base began to question. But remember, this small conservative base is plundering the country. These people are making monies beyond their wildest dreams. They're not going to challenge this regime. They're going to fight for this regime. They lie with absolute impunity.
Right.
And their narrative is, we're telling the truth because the United States is afraid of us, because we have been so brave, they are denying the fact that we, but they lie about everything, like the story of the airplane,
Right.
the story of the 70 people killed in demonstrations in favor of Soleimani. This regime has killed at least 600 people, minimum. Reuters puts it at 1,500. They haven't made a single official statement about how many people they have killed. How can this be? The minority takes it because it says these were infidels sent in by Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States. The majority are angry.
Right. In the back, yeah, please.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you. My name is Loretto, and thank you for having this forum. And hashtag no war with Iran. My husband used to work for the Imperial Iranian Air Force during the Shah's time, and his father worked also in Bushehr. My husband also worked for Aramco, and there's a lot of Filipinos all over the world, especially in the Middle East, working over there, so I'm very concerned about what's going to happen. Very concerned about a lot of the resignations at the Pentagon. So I'd like to know your thoughts, anybody who could answer or want to answer what's going on, because it affects the policy and decision making at the Pentagon. Thank you.
Yeah, so
And just to prepare the next question, if I see a student, you'll get the next question, okay? If I see, all right, right there, okay. The next one is that student right behind you. Sorry.
yeah, so
We'll just go back and forth, okay?
Loretto, thanks for your question. And Brett may have some insight, having been, worked in the Obama administration, and then worked through the first couple years of the Trump administration. But I think it's not just about any particular resignations at the Defense Department. I'm not sure that any particular person is a single point of failure on this. That's the good news. The bad news is we've been hemorrhaging talent for years. Some of this predates the Trump administration, frankly, but it's been massively accelerated. The civilian side of the Defense Department is at its weakest point in my memory, which means that the military has a disproportionate say on things, and I have a lot of faith in our military, but a civil-military balance, even at the Pentagon, is essential. That's a challenge. I can't imagine the civilian leadership that I worked for under Bob Gates at the Pentagon presenting the set of slides that the Pentagon apparently presented to Trump down at Mar-a-Lago. But it's not just at the Pentagon. We've hemorrhaged talent at the State Department. People have left the intelligence community. It's a big challenge, frankly, for whoever's the next administration, whether it's in a year or 5 years, because they might get into the cockpit, turn the key, and realize there's no engine to the national security bureaucracy. But the second thing, which isn't about people, is about process. The national security process, which has essentially been kind of fairly similar since Scowcroft put in place a set of procedures at the National Security Council, is indescribably broken under this administration. You have people who don't reflect the authority or share the beliefs of the president. You have all these people who are acting. You have 4 national security advisors in barely 3 years, and you're just not seeing a process that's ginned up for a significant crisis. And this is a significant crisis. And so I worry that we are not well equipped if we go down the road of further and further escalation. And in fact, when considering escalation, the President of the United States should have thought whether his government is ready for the second and third order consequences, not just what the second and third order consequences are. And I don't know anybody who could tell you in a straight face that our national security bureaucracy is in a very good place to manage a significant international crisis at the moment. It's just not.
Do you want to add anything, Brad? Or?
Nothing to add.
Okay. In the back, yeah.
Hi, my name is Isabel, and I'm a senior here at Stanford. And my question is that I've been trying to keep up with what's going on in Iran in the newspapers, but one thing that I've not seen, I think repercussions in Iraq have been discussed at length, but I've not seen anyone writing about how this will play out in Syria. And so I was wondering if anyone on the panel has any ideas about how this will either change American involvement in Syria, or if we'll see meaningful change in policy from an Iranian or a Russian perspective.
Great question. Brett?
Raise your hand on the panel if you've been to Syria in the last year. Brett?
Syria is just an awful, tragic story. And to my point of ends, ways, and means, I've been a critic of every administration I've ever served in. I think saying Assad must go without any idea of how you're going to bring that about or what would come next, I think was a tragic mistake. Getting to the Trump administration, this gets to the last question, the policy process versus the president. And like the wheel doesn't connect to the engine, right? So the policy process tends to result in these maximalist objectives with a president that does not want to put any more resources into the Middle East. So I experienced this up close. There was a policy process on Syria that was run from the White House and the National Security Advisor and everybody, and it kept increasing our objectives in Syria. So the president, and I used to remind people of this at the time, after we took Raqqa from ISIS, we were going to put in about $200 million for the post-conflict, try to get water, make sure people can generally go back to their areas as much as possible. $200 million US money is not that much. And I, as the leader of the coalition, I thought, and my forecast was we would be able to get about $1 billion from the coalition with our $200 million. President Trump read about that in the newspaper and said, we're not spending any money in Syria, and he cut all of our funding. And he made clear we're not getting any more military resources. So we have no more resources. And yet our objectives in Syria kept increasing. So the stated objective that came out of that policy review was that we don't say this, but it's kind of Assad through this Geneva process. We want to see Assad gone. We would all love to see that. But that's probably going to be very difficult. Second, a new objective was put that we want to see all Iranians leave Syria, even as Trump says he wants all Americans to leave Syria. So again, you have this complete incoherence. And I think where we are in Syria now, I think we gave up a decent hand. We had a decent hand in which out of the counter-ISIS campaign, about a third of the country was influenced by actors who I think shared our values. And it gave us influence at the table. Because in Syria, you're sitting at the table with the Russians, Turkey, other players who have very significant long-term interests in Syria. And you have to sit there with some significant leverage. But the Iran policy has also made it difficult because when it comes to Syria, and this is my final point, and this gets to my point about if you're in the Situation Room, or, okay, what's my objective, how am I going to do it, and what are my resources? Who are the players in Syria? Number one, the Syrian regime. As odious and criminal as that regime is, they are there. We don't deal with the regime. We have no contact with the regime. We don't talk to them. Second, the Iranians. As a criminal outlaw regime, they're there. They've been there for decades. They're there. But we don't talk to them. We don't deal with them at all. That means we have no way to really significantly deal with two of the main players on the ground. We do deal with the Russians, and I used to lead a channel with the Russians, so I know what this is like. But we're trying to encourage the Russians to do what we want with these other two actors, which is very hard because the Russians don't share our interests. So our influence and leverage in Syria is significantly diminished. And I think we need to be realistic about what we can achieve. What can we achieve in Syria? In my view, we have really two core interests. We want to make sure ISIS can't resurge, and we want to make sure that the Iranians cannot set up basically a beachhead to threaten Israel, which will start a broader regional war. Those are very limited objectives. I think we can achieve those objectives, but I unfortunately at this point, I have very little confidence that we will be able to bring any sort of diplomatic resolution to the Syrian campaign. Today in the UN Security Council, they're voting to continue humanitarian access into like Idlib province. There's 3 million civilians trapped in this terrible crossfire between al-Qaeda groups and the regime. It's horrible. But we've been helping to supply at least humanitarian aid. That might be rescinded at the Security Council today. I'm not sure. I hope it passes. So there are no good answers, but there's also no coherent policy because our objectives are up here, our resources are down here, and Trump wants nothing to do with Syria.
Can I just add one thing? Because Isabel,
You could add two things.
Well, but I'll say one thing and probably do two things. Anyway, so as it relates to U.S. objectives in Syria, which I think are even the narrowest objective, is that we have an incentive in or a reason to not have ISIS come back in Syria. And I think that's actually where the most likely consequences of the recent events are likely to play out. And that's because, as you'll recall, Trump has repeatedly said he's going to pull out troops from Syria, and we went from 2,000 to then 1,000, and then he said when he let the Turks come in that we're going to leave altogether, and then the Pentagon said, yeah, but maybe we can leave a few hundred people there to protect the oil, right? Remember, Mr. President, remember how you said you wanted to get the oil? And he said, oh, right. And so he left a couple of hundred American forces and tanks in eastern Syria in the mid-Euphrates River Valley to protect some oil fields. But our ability to have those forces protect themselves but also prosecute what's left of the counter-ISIS campaign in Syria is completely dependent on Iraq, because we were able to make up for some of the withdrawal from Syria by using assets in northern and western Iraq to take strikes against ISIS targets and also to resupply the troops in eastern Syria, where those supply routes come over land from northern and western Iraq. And so if we get kicked out of Iraq, then our ability to maintain even a de minimis presence inside of Syria in pursuit of that very limited counter-ISIS objective, I wouldn't want to leave a couple 100 guys stranded in the middle of the desert in eastern Syria without the backup in Iraq. So that's another consequence I think we should keep in
There's
mind.
one other point that I think you should remember about Syria. Israel had been taking the fight to Iran in Syria in the month before. They had literally taken out about 70% of Iran's assets in Syria. Because Iran didn't want to make a fight with Israel, they basically kept quiet. They have virtually said nothing about it. If there is an attack now, with the regime having made threats, I'm not sure that they're going to keep silent again. So that aspect of it, in terms of the Syria reality.
I'll just add one more thing, which is estimates to rebuild northwestern Iraq are in the tens of billions of dollars post-ISIS. So they're already struggling with everything going on in terms of the corruption, the problems there. If you don't engage in, and so I can't even imagine what the estimates are going to be like for Syria. And I don't see anybody really coming forward in a way to try to make that reality. And if you don't rebuild in northwestern Iraq, if you don't rebuild Mosul, if you don't start to create some infrastructure there, of course these areas become more susceptible to non-state actors. So it's just a problem that continues to feed on itself, and of course it's all interrelated.
So we have 9 minutes left. We have to end right at 1:30. I think one of our guests has to be on, 2:30. I think somebody has to be on TV or something. So what we're going to do, I'm going to take a speed round right now of 4 or 5 questions, depending on how long the questions are. Why don't you all take notes, and everybody will get about 90 seconds to answer whatever you want. So Gabby, let's start with you.
Hi, I'm Sonia Shin with NBC Bay Area News. So I was reading today that U.S. officials announced that, or according to U.S. officials, that the strike on Soleimani, the same day that that he passed, that there was also a strike targeting Abdul Reza Shalai, a financier and key commander, and this raises questions about whether the mission was designed to cripple leadership or to prevent an imminent attack, and would like to see what you would comment about that, on this possibly being a much larger operation.
Okay, now Gabby. We're taking a group of questions right now. I apologize. So can you hand the microphone to this woman right here? Thank you. And then here, there, and there. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you had a question, Gabby. Oh, okay. Go ahead, sir. Sorry.
My name is Michael. I'm a freshman. I just want to say thank you for the privilege of hearing you speak. My question is, first, we've heard a lot about the possibility of Iran mobilizing the proxies to act at their behest, but could you speak about maybe some of these proxies being galvanized to act without Iran's actual command, and how the U.S. could possibly prepare for that?
Great question right here.
I also want to express my gratitude for everybody being here as well. My name is Daniel. I'm a freshman as well at Stanford. And when I first heard the news of the killing of Soleimani, my concern was the global community might see this as a hegemonic power using and even arguably abusing its power to serve its own interests, especially if you're talking about a country like Russia, which has a zero-sum mentality, or a country like China trying to increase its presence in the Middle East. So my question is, how does the killing of Soleimani affect U.S.-Russia relations and affect U.S.-China relations?
Great. This gentleman right here, and then the woman in the Stanford sweatshirt. You had a question. Okay. So this person will get the last question. You're the penultimate, and you're the last question. And you're taking time from our speakers, so keep them quick.
Very good. My question is, don't you think U.S. policy is further pushing Iran toward the left of the Russians?
Okay, last question.
Could you please compare the U.S. domestic response to the fraudulent claims of weapons of mass destruction for all the people who aren't reading the news back then, and the domestic reception of claims of an imminent attack? Whether there's more skepticism, less. Thanks.
So we have 5 minutes. Why don't we just go right down let's go in reverse order. Brett, why don't you start and we'll end.
Yes, a larger op. I only have information what's in the newspaper, maybe, but it seemed that this was a target of opportunity against Soleimani. A lot of the stuff on the imminence, as someone who used to read a lot of intelligence, particularly about Soleimani, he's always had capability, and it was always the question of was he actually going to turn that on or off? So I just can't speak to what they may have had, but the shifting explanation since the strike just shows, I think, a level of lack of coordination and a failure to really fully game this out.
Lisa.
So one of the interesting things about China's influence in the Middle East is they tend to do this without a very strong hand with regard to the political. They don't want to have the lens turned on them from a political perspective, so they're not really looking very closely at the domestic democratic institutions or other institutions within these countries. And I think that for some people in the Middle East, this might be somewhat refreshing, right? That there's this idea that, maybe you're going to have some economic assistance, but there will not be a lot of intervention in the domestic politics of the area. And so from that perspective, for an Iraqi population that's pretty fatigued with the US, maybe fatigued with Iran, maybe are somewhat questioning what's going on with Russia next door in Syria, who knows, this could be an opportunity to pursue more of the Chinese economic agenda in terms of this kind of transcontinental economic program.
Well, in terms of the Soleimani, to say that Soleimani was planning an attack on the U.S. is stating the obvious. That has been his portfolio for the last 20 years. Now, whether he was up to something that was remarkably new, even in that case, I would have thought trying to prevent that action might be less costly than going after him in the way they went, going after him in Iraq, trying to prevent the consequences of his imminent threat would have been, in my view, less strategically costly. I doubt that Iran's major proxies, for example, like Hezbollah or Hashr al-Sha'bi, will take on the United States without the approval of Iran, without the support of Iran. There are splinter groups, and there are malignant small groups who would want a war between Iran and the United States. What they might do to trigger, what they might do to create a kind of a crisis, I don't know. And I can't agree more with this question that I think the amount of Russian influence and the absolute inattention in the United States to that increased influence, to me, is one of the most remarkable failures of the Trump policy on Iran.
So one last word to you. Remember our question from our colleagues at NBC.
Right. So I'm going to start there because I want to connect that question with the final question.
Great.
So I think the Yemen strike, we need to learn more about it. It's just obviously being reported today. I think it strengthens the interpretation that the strike was taken on Soleimani not to address a particular imminent threat, but rather to reestablish deterrence. And that, in fact, if you look at the Pentagon statement that was released immediately after Soleimani was killed, the word imminent did not appear in that statement, but the word reestablish deterrence did. And we also know, well, we think we know from the reporting that Trump was presented with the Soleimani option after the Kateb Hezbollah rocket strike. So it was originally put on the table as a retaliatory measure, not something to head off an existing attack. And I think it got put back on the table after the siege of the American embassy. I think Trump was afraid of personally looking weak, but also saying, look, I'm going to show these guys I mean business to deter future attacks. By the way, one could agree that that's a good thing to do, right? We can have a debate about that. It is a flimsier legal argument, to go back to Professor Sagan's point, which is why I think the administration continues to focus on imminence, even though the people briefed on that intelligence are not convinced for the reasons that Brett noted, that they're always planning something, and Soleimani's always planning something. But I think it just speaks to the notion that this was really about firing a shot across Iran's bow to try to deter future attacks. I'm not convinced it's going to work. It's, even if one agrees that it was a just thing to do or a legal thing to do, The real question is, was it a strategic or wise thing to do? And I think that is much more open to debate, because I think we're likely to be on a cycle where we're not preventing future attacks. We are going to have more attacks in places like Iraq. In fact, the threat of that is so all-consuming that that's all our forces in Iraq are focused on right now, instead of focusing on ISIS. But maybe the administration has some intelligence that I'm not privy to, which goes to this last question is, but how would we take their word for it? I mean, Abbas talked about the Iranian regime lying through its teeth and therefore nobody taking it at face value. And you know, I worked in the administration. I think we tried to be on the level all the time. But people might have disagreed. And obviously, the WMD situation with George W. Bush was a calamity because it resulted in the Iraq War. But this is different right now, because we have a president who objective third-party fact checkers have said has lied 15,000 times about important things in office. Why would anybody give him the benefit of the doubt about anything? This is a president who repeatedly exaggerates things, repeatedly lies, repeatedly plays fast and loose with the truth, and does other things like bash our allies all the time, and all these chickens are coming home to roost. Because wouldn't it be nice, when we're facing the biggest international crisis we've had of this administration, to have the rest of the world at our side? And we don't, because they don't trust the good word of the United States, they don't trust the President of the United States, and we don't have any friends. And whatever you think of this policy, that's not a situation I would want to be in. Even if I wanted to execute Trump's policy, I'd like to do it with some faith and confidence in the President, in the United States of America, and some allies at our side, and that's not the situation we're in. Thanks.
So I want to say two things in conclusion. First, I just want you all to understand how incredibly fortunate we are here at Stanford and FSI and in the community to have such a fantastic group of people that on a moment's notice would respond to an email and come talk to us. And just secondly, I just want to thank all of you for adjusting your schedules and being here with us today. And we look forward to learning more from you, both on the FSI website, on the Iranian Studies website, on Twitter, on TV, in op-eds. But thank you all for being here today.
Thank you all.